Chapter 10 Births. I wanted to know what Kunti looked like. I thought it would be wise preparation in case she turned out to be my mother-in-law. Perhaps her face would give me a clue as to what lay inside. I hadn't forgotten the sorceress's warning. But the artist didn't have a picture of her. He sent me, with apologies, a different portrait, that of Gandhari, Duryodhan's mother, and Arjun's aunt. The portrait was small, about a handspan square, and ill-executed, as though painted by an apprentice. Perhaps there wasn't much demand for the pictures of women once they were married off, even if they were queens. Dhaima and I pored over it, trying to make out her features, but they were mostly obscured by a thick, white blindfold. "You know the story," Dhaima said. When she heard that she was to marry the blind Dhritarashtra, she tied it over her eyes, declaring she didn't want to enjoy the pleasures her husband had been deprived of. They say she has never removed it since. I'd heard the story, or, more accurately, the song that had been composed in honor of her devotion to her husband. From time to time my father sent bards to my apartments, hoping that their songs would instill appropriate attitudes in me and warn me of dangerous ones. Thus far I had also been subjected to the lives of Savitri, who heroically saved her husband from the clutches of Lord Death, Sita, who was eternally faithful to her husband. Even when abducted by a demon king, and Devyani, who, in spite of her father's warnings, insisted on falling in love with the wrong man and was left broken-hearted. Between ourselves, though, Dhaima and I agreed that Gandhari's sacrifice wasn't particularly intelligent. If my husband couldn't see, I'd make doubly sure to keep my own eyes open, I said, so that I could report everything that was going on to him. Dhaima was of a different opinion. Maybe the thought of marrying a blind man disgusted her, but, being a princess, she couldn't get out of the match. Maybe she did this so she wouldn't have to look at him every single day of her life. The portrait must have been an old one. In it, Gandhari looked pretty in a lost, girlish way. Tendrils of hair fell over her forehead, and she had a listening air, as though she was trying to compensate for her lost sight. I wondered if there were days when she regretted her decision to opt for wifely virtue instead of the power she could have had as the blind king's guide and adviser. But she had made a vow and was trapped in the net of her own words. Her mouth was strong, though, and her pale, beautiful lips balanced disappointment with resolution. Gandhari's marriage, although she had given up so much for its sake, was like Kunti's, not a very happy one. Later I would wonder if that was what gave them strength, both these queens. Perhaps, but I'd got the cause and effect mixed up. Perhaps strong women tended to have unhappy marriages. The idea troubled me. Dhritarashtra was a bitter man. He never got over the fact that he had been passed over by the elders just because he was blind, when they decided which of the brothers should be king. Though he claimed to love his younger brother and possibly did, for he was a strange and contradictory man. He must have been delighted when the curse blighted Pandu withdrew into the forest. The goal of Dhritarashtra's life was to have a son who could inherit the throne after him. But here a problem arose, for, in spite of his assiduous attempts, Gandhari didn't conceive for many years, and when she finally did, it was too late. Kunti was already pregnant with Yudhishthir. A year came, a year went. Yudhishthir was born. As the first male child of the next generation, the elders declared the throne would be his. Dhritarashtra's spies brought more bad news. Kunti was pregnant again. Now there were two obstacles between Dhritarashtra and his desire. Gandhari's stomach grew large as a giant beehive, but her body refused to go into labor. Perhaps the frustrated king berated her, or perhaps the fact that he had taken one of her waiting women as his mistress drove Gandhari to her act of desperation. She struck her stomach again and again until she bled, and, bleeding, gave birth to a huge, unformed ball of flesh. The palace was in an uproar, Daima said. People running around wringing their hands, crying that this was the work of demons. The blind king sitting stunned on his throne while Gandhari lay in a faint. But luckily a holy man showed up. He cut the ball into 101 pieces and called for vats of butter, one for each piece. He sealed the pieces in the vats and cautioned that they shouldn't be opened for a year. And that's how Duryodhan and his brothers and their sister Dushsala were born. Maybe that's why he's such great friends with Karna, who also came into the world in a strange way. Heat rose to my face at the sudden mention of Karna's name. To hide it, I quipped, "Doesn't anyone have normal births anymore?" Daima gave me a sharp glance, but if she had a question, she didn't ask it. Was it because she didn't know what to do with the answer? "You're a fine one to talk," she snorted, and then went on with the story. Most people think that Adiratha, a chariot driver, is Karna's father, but one of our stable boys that used to work in Hastinapur a while back told us a different story. Adiratha found Karna on the river Ganga one morning when he had gone there to pray, floating in a wooden casket. He was just a week old then. That part isn't so uncommon. Once in a while, a noble woman will get in trouble and dispose of the evidence this way. But there was something special about this child. He had gold rings in his ears and the gold armor that covered his chest. Why, you couldn't take it off. It was part of his body. Adiratha believed the gods had answered his prayers and sent Karna to him, because he didn't have any children. Maybe Adiratha wasn't completely wrong. I remembered the otherworldly expression on Karna's face in the portrait. He looked as though sometime, somewhere, he had been touched by a divine hand. I wished there had been a way for me to buy that portrait, to secret it away, to look at it whenever I wanted. But, of course, such an action was impossible. A princess has no privacy. Daima shot me another glance before heaving her body off the floor. I'd better get to work, and you're late for your dance lesson, as usual. At the door she paused. This time, the warning in her voice was a serious one. Sometimes I talk too much. If you know what's good for you, you'll put that story out of your mind and behave in a way that doesn't bring shame to your royal father. I knew what she was referring to, and she was right. But my disobedient heart kept going back to Karna, to that most unfortunate moment in his life. We had both been victims of parental rejection. Was that why his story resonated so? But my suffering couldn't compare to his. Over and over I imagined the mother who had abandoned him, for I was sure that it was she and not the gods that had set him afloat on the river. Against my closed eyelids I saw her as she bent to the water to cast the child, her own sweet, sleeping flesh, into its night currents. In my imagination she was very young, and the curve of her turned away face was a little like Gandhari's, though that was a silly thing to think of. She didn't weep. She had no tears left, only fear for her reputation, which made her draw her shawl more closely over her head as she watched the casket. Just for a moment, then she'd have to hurry back. She had left all her jewelry in her bedchamber, had clothed herself in her oldest sari. Still, it would be a disaster if the city watchman discovered her so far from her parents' mansion at a time when only prostitutes are abroad. She choked down a cry as the bobbing casket disappeared around a bend in the river. Then she walked home, her steps only a little unsteady, thinking, "At least it's done." My heart ached for both mother and child because even I knew so little of life could guess that such things were never done. For the rest of her life she would wonder where her son was. Passing every handsome stranger, she'd ask herself, just as he would walking by women he didn't know, could this be? Each morning when they woke, in the same town or kingdoms apart, their first thoughts would be of each other. In anger and regret, they'd both wish she had had the courage to choose another way,